For as long as she could remember, she had lived happily as a girl with her loving parents, believing her life was perfectly ordinary. But one day, on her way home from school, she noticed a missing person ad flashing on a digital screen at a bus stop shelter featuring a little boy. This single ad would change her life forever, leading her to uncover her parents' dark secret, a truth far more sinister than any child her age should ever have to bear. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Leona Sanders, a 9-year-old girl with brown hair and fair skin, stood outside her elementary school in Washington. It was Friday afternoon, and the excitement of the impending weekend and school holidays buzzed among the students around her. Leona, however, stood quietly, her small backpack clutched tightly to her chest as she scanned the street for any sign of her mother. The school day had been long and challenging, particularly due to the math test that had loomed over the third graders all week. Leona felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as she replayed the test questions in her mind, wondering if she had performed as well as she hoped. As the minutes ticked by, more and more of her classmates were picked up by their parents or boarded the yellow school buses. Leona watched them go, a twinge of impatience growing in her chest. She knew her mother worked hard and sometimes ran late, but the wait always felt longer when she was alone. Finally, just as Leona was considering asking the school secretary to call home, she spotted a familiar figure rounding the corner. Rebecca Sanders, Leona's mother, walked briskly towards the school, her long coat billowing slightly in the breeze. "Mom!" Leona called out, her face breaking into a wide smile as she ran to meet her mother. Rebecca's tired expression softened as she saw her daughter. She opened her arms wide, enveloping Leona in a warm embrace. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice muffled against Leona's hair. "I'm sorry I'm a little late. How was your day?" Leona pulled back, her eyes bright with a mix of emotions. "It was okay," she said, her voice betraying a hint of the stress she'd felt earlier. "We had our math test today. It was pretty hard, but I think I did all right." Rebecca nodded sympathetically. "I'm sure you did great, honey. You've been studying so hard for it." As they began to walk away from the school, hand in hand, Leona looked up at her mother. "How was your day, Mom?" "Was work busy?" Rebecca sighed, running her free hand through her hair. "It was challenging," she admitted. "But it's over now, and I'm happy it's the weekend. We both deserve a break, don't we?" Leona nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I'm so glad it's Friday, and we have school holidays now too." They continued their walk, Leona chattering about the various events of her school day. The funny thing her best friend Zoe said at lunch, the new art project they started in class, and of course more details about the dreaded math test. They arrived at the bus stop just a short distance from the school. It was a simple structure with a bench and a clear plastic shelter, currently empty save for them. As they sat down to wait, Leona's attention was drawn to the digital ad display mounted on one side of the shelter. The screen, which had been showing an advertisement for a local restaurant, suddenly changed. Leona's eyes widened as she saw the image that appeared, a missing poster featuring a young boy, no more than 2 years old, with tousled brown hair and big, sad eyes. "Mom, look," Leona said, pointing at the screen. "It's a missing kid. Why do little kids go missing? Don't their parents look after them?" Rebecca, who had been absently scrolling through her phone, looked up at Leona's words. As her gaze fell on the missing person ad, something changed in her expression. It was subtle, a tightening around her eyes, a slight parting of her lips. But Leona noticed it immediately. "Mom," Leona prompted when her mother didn't respond. Rebecca blinked as if coming out of a trance. "Well, honey, these ads are there in hope that the public saw that person somewhere," she said, her voice slightly strained. Leona frowned, unsatisfied with the answer. "Yes, but why do they just disappear?" "Don't their parents care? Why don't they search for their child themselves?" Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the ad, which now displayed the name Tom Rockwell beneath the boy's photo. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. Just as Leona was about to ask again, The rumble of an approaching bus broke the tension. Rebecca stood up abruptly, taking Leona's hand. "Look, the bus is here," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Let's go home, shall we?" As they boarded the bus, Leona cast one last glance at the ad display. The image of the little boy with sad eyes stayed with her, a nagging question that remained unanswered. The bus interior was warm and stuffy, a stark contrast to the crisp autumn air outside. Leona and Rebecca found seats near the middle of the bus, settling into the worn fabric cushions. As the bus lurched into motion, Leona's mind was still buzzing with questions about the missing child that she had seen. "Mom," she began, her voice quiet but persistent, "how do people just go missing?" "I don't understand." Rebecca, who had been staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes, turned to face her daughter. Her expression was a mixture of fatigue and something else Leona couldn't quite place. Was it worry, frustration? "Leona, please," Rebecca said, her voice strained. "I've had a long day at work and I need some peace right now. Can we talk about something else?" Leona's face fell, a pang of guilt washing over her. "I'm sorry, Mom, I didn't know you were so tired." Rebecca's expression softened, and she reached out to stroke Leona's hair. "It's okay, sweetheart. You couldn't have known. Let's just enjoy the ride home, all right?" Leona nodded, leaning into her mother's touch. They sat in silence for a few moments, the gentle rocking of the bus and the muffled conversations of other passengers creating a soothing background noise. Suddenly, a sharp electronic chime cut through the ambient sounds. Rebecca reached into her purse, pulling out her smartphone. She glanced at the screen and then back at Leona. "It's time for your medicine, honey," Rebecca said, already reaching back into her purse. Leona's nose wrinkled slightly. "Do I have to?" "My stomach feels empty. Can't I eat something first?" Rebecca shook her head firmly. "You know the rules, Leona. You have to take your asthma medicine at this time. No excuses." She pulled out a small pill bottle and a water bottle from her bag. Leona's shoulders slumped, but she knew better than to argue. As she reluctantly held out her hand for the pill, Rebecca's voice softened. "Remember when you almost suffocated during sleep?" she asked gently. "It was because you didn't take your asthma pills that day." A flicker of fear passed through Leona's eyes as the memory surfaced. She remembered waking up in the middle of the night, her chest tight, struggling to draw breath. It had been terrifying. "But Mom," Leona said hesitantly, "I remember taking my pills that day. Why didn't they work?" Rebecca paused for a moment, her hand still outstretched with the pill. "Well," she said slowly, "you didn't take the pill on time that day. You took it too late, so it didn't work as intended." Leona frowned slightly, trying to reconcile this explanation with her own hazy memories of that night, but the recollection of the fear she had felt was enough to push away any doubts. She took the pill from her mother's hand and swallowed it with a gulp of water. "Good girl," Rebecca said, giving Leona a small smile. "I know it's not fun, but it's important for your health." The rest of the short bus ride passed in relative silence. Leona watched the familiar streets of their neighborhood pass by outside the window, her mind drifting between thoughts of the math test, the missing boy on the poster, and the unpleasant taste the pill had left in her mouth. Finally, the bus pulled up to their stop. As they disembarked and began the short walk to their house, Leona's spirits lifted at the sight of her father's car in the driveway. "Dad's home early," she exclaimed, picking up her pace. They reached the front door, and as Rebecca fumbled with her keys, it swung open to reveal Calvin Sanders, Leona's father. His face broke into a wide smile at the sight of them. "There are my two favorite girls," he said, opening his arms wide. Leona rushed forward, throwing herself into her father's embrace. "Dad, you're home early." Calvin chuckled, lifting Leona off her feet in a bear hug. "I sure am, Pumpkin. Thought we could all spend some extra time together since it's the start of your school holidays." As he set Leona down, he turned to Rebecca, giving her a quick kiss. "How was your day, honey?" Rebecca's smile seemed a bit forced as she returned the kiss. "It was fine, just a long day." Calvin nodded understandingly, then clapped his hands together. Well, I've got an idea to cheer everyone up. How about we all cook dinner together tonight? It's Friday, after all. We could make it a family activity. Leona's face lit up at the suggestion. Oh, can we? That sounds fun. But before Calvin could respond, Rebecca cut in. Actually, Calvin, I need to discuss something with you first. She turned to Leona, her voice softening. Sweetheart, why don't you go watch some TV in the living room while your father and I talk for a bit? Leona's excitement deflated slightly, but she nodded. Okay, Mom. As she made her way to the living room, she could hear her parents' hushed voices behind her. She couldn't make out the words, but something in their tone made her feel uneasy. The muffled sounds of her parents' conversation drifted from the bedroom as Leona sat on the living room sofa, the TV remote in her hand. She flicked through the channels, not really paying attention to the colorful images flashing across the screen. Her mind was preoccupied with curiosity about what her parents were discussing so intently. As she absently channel surfed, her gaze wandered to the coffee table in front of her. A small pile of mail sat on its surface, likely brought in by her father earlier. Among the envelopes and flyers, a corner of a newspaper peeked out, catching Leona's attention. Setting down the remote, she leaned forward and gently tugged the newspaper free from the pile. As it came into full view, Leona's breath caught in her throat. There on the front page was the same image she had seen on the bus stop advertisement, the missing boy, Tom Rockwell. The photograph seemed even more poignant in print. The boy's brown eyes stared out at her, a mixture of innocence and sadness that tugged at Leona's heart. She found herself wondering again about the circumstances that led to his disappearance. How could someone so young just vanish? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Leona's mind drifted to the safety lessons her parents had drilled into her over the years. Never talk to strangers. Don't accept rides from anyone you don't know. Always let Mom or Dad know where you are. These rules had always seemed like common sense to Leona, but now, faced with the reality of a missing child, they took on a new, more ominous significance. She was so engrossed in her thoughts that she didn't hear the bedroom door open. It wasn't until her parents entered the living room that Leona snapped back to the present, quickly setting the newspaper aside. Calvin and Rebecca approached, their faces composed but with a lingering tension that Leona couldn't quite place. They seemed to be making an effort to appear cheerful, but there was something off about their smiles. So, sweetheart, Calvin said, his voice overly bright, have you decided what you'd like us to cook for dinner? Leona, still slightly distracted by her earlier thoughts, took a moment to respond. Oh, we haven't had spaghetti in a long time. Could we make that? Calvin's smile became more genuine. Spaghetti sounds perfect. Great idea, Pumpkin. As Calvin moved towards the kitchen, presumably to start gathering ingredients, Leona stood up from the sofa. She picked up the newspaper, holding it out to her mother. Mom, look, she said, pointing to the front page. It's the same boy from the ad at the bus stop. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and intense. She snatched the newspaper from Leona's hands, her face paling slightly as she looked at the image. Leona, she said, her voice strained, you shouldn't be reading the newspaper, it's for adults. Before Leona could protest, Rebecca turned to Calvin, who had paused in the kitchen doorway. See, she said, her voice low but urgent. I told you. The two shared a loaded glance, communicating something that Leona couldn't understand. The tension in the room seemed to thicken, and Leona felt a growing sense of unease. Mom? Dad, she ventured hesitantly. What's going on? Is everything okay? Her parents exchanged another look before Calvin spoke. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Your mother and I just need to discuss something quickly. Adult stuff, you know. Leona's brow furrowed. But what about dinner? And why can't I listen too? I'm not a baby anymore. Rebecca stepped forward, placing a hand on Leona's shoulder. We know you're not a baby, honey, but there are some things that adults need to talk about privately. We won't be long, I promise. With that, her parents retreated back to the bedroom once again, closing the door behind them. Leona stood in the living room, feeling confused and slightly hurt. She couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, something that involved her but that her parents weren't sharing. For a few minutes, Leona tried to distract herself by watching TV again, but her attention kept drifting to the closed bedroom door. The muffled sounds of her parents' voices, occasionally rising in what sounded like disagreement, only fueled her curiosity and concern. Finally, unable to resist, Leona crept quietly to the bedroom door. She pressed her ear against the wood, straining to make out what her parents were saying. Most of the words were too muffled to understand, but a few phrases came through clearly. Bad idea. Move to a new state. Leona's heart began to race. Move to a new state. What were they talking about? Just as she was about to lean in closer, hoping to hear more, the voices inside the room suddenly went quiet. Before Leona could react, the door swung open. She stumbled back, nearly losing her balance as she came face to face with her father. Calvin's expression was a mixture of surprise and disappointment. "Leona," he said, his voice stern, "what are you doing? We told you this was an adult matter." Leona felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and a touch of guilt. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I was just curious. What did you mean about moving to a new state?" Rebecca appeared behind Calvin, her face tightening at Leona's question. "Oh, sweetie," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow to Leona's ears. "You must have misheard us. We were just talking about our holiday plans. It was supposed to be a surprise." Leona looked between her parents, confusion and doubt warring inside her. She wanted to believe them, but something about their explanation felt off. The tension in their faces, the urgency in their voices she had overheard. It didn't match up with a simple discussion about a holiday. But before she could voice her doubts or ask any more questions, the shrill ring of a phone cut through the air. Rebecca hurried to answer it, leaving Leona and Calvin standing awkwardly in the doorway. As Rebecca spoke on the phone, her expression changed from worried to relieved. She covered the mouthpiece with her hand and turned to Leona. "It's your best friend Zoe," she said. "She's asking if you want to come over to play. Would you like that?" The sudden change of subject threw Leona off balance. She blinked, trying to process the shift from the tense atmosphere of moments ago to this casual invitation. Yes," she said, her voice uncertain. "But I thought we were going to cook dinner together." Calvin cleared his throat. "Well, we can always cook later. Maybe it would be good for you to spend some time with Zoe." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, and it'll give your father and I some time to discuss our holiday plans in more detail." Leona looked between her parents, still feeling unsettled, but the prospect of seeing her best friend was tempting, especially after the strange tension of the past few minutes. "Okay," she said finally. "I'd like to go to Zoe's." As Rebecca confirmed the plans with Zoe's mother on the phone, Leona couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. Her parents seemed almost too eager to send her away, and the mystery of their private conversation still nagged at her. But for now she pushed those thoughts aside. Maybe spending time with Zoe would help clear her head. As she went to get her shoes and jacket, Leona resolved to try and enjoy her time with her friend. Whatever was going on with her parents, she was sure they would explain everything to her soon. They had to, right? The car ride to Zoe's house was short, barely 2 minutes, but to Leona it felt much longer. The silence in the vehicle was thick with unspoken tension, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. Leona sat in the back seat, her small hands fidgeting with the seatbelt strap, her mind racing with questions she both wanted and feared to ask. Finally, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, Leona spoke up. "Dad?" she began hesitantly, her voice small in the confines of the car. "Where are we going on holiday?" Calvin's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, meeting Leona's gaze for a brief moment before returning to the road. "Well, sweetheart," he said, his tone carefully measured. "It's supposed to be a surprise. Your mother and I still need to discuss the details." Leona frowned, not satisfied with the vague answer. "But why is it such a big secret? And why did you need to talk about it right away?" Calvin's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Sometimes adults need to plan things carefully, Leona. We want to make sure everything is perfect for our trip. But, Leona started to protest, but Calvin cut her off gently. Look, we're here, he said, pulling up in front of Zoe's house. Let's not worry about this now, okay? Go have fun with your friend? Leona unbuckled her seatbelt, still feeling unsettled. As she opened the car door, she turned back to her father. You'll pick me up later, right? Calvin nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Of course. I'll be back in 2 or 3 hours. Be good, okay? Leona nodded and stepped out of the car. As she walked towards the house, she saw Zoe and her mother, Melanie, waiting at the front door. Zoe waved excitedly, and Leona felt some of her worries start to melt away at the sight of her best friend's smile. Leona! Zoe called out, rushing down the front steps to meet her. The two girls hugged, giggling as they nearly lost their balance. Melanie approached more slowly, a warm smile on her face. Hello, Leona, she said kindly. It's good to see you. Zoe's been so excited for your visit. As they all headed inside, Melanie added, I'm just finishing up some cleaning in Zoe's room. Why don't you girls play in the living room for now? The girls agreed readily, already deep in conversation about their day at school and the math test they had taken. They settled on the living room carpet, deciding to work on a puzzle together. As Zoe dumped out the puzzle pieces from the box, Leona's eye was drawn once again to a newspaper on the nearby coffee table. With a jolt of recognition, she realized it was the same newspaper she had seen at home with the missing boy on the front page. Almost without thinking, Leona reached out and picked up the newspaper. Hey Zoe, she said, holding it up. We have the same newspaper at home, isn't that funny? Zoe looked up from the puzzle pieces, her eyes focusing on the front page. As she took in the image of the missing boy, a mischievous grin spread across her face. Oh my gosh, Leona, she said, giggling. That boy looks just like you. Leona's brow furrowed in confusion. What? No, he doesn't. That's a boy, Zoe. I'm a girl. But Zoe, caught up in what she thought was a great joke, continued to tease. No, really. Look at his hair and his eyes. It's like looking at boy Leona. Leona felt a surge of anger and hurt rise in her chest. That's not funny, Zoe, she said, her voice rising. I'm not a boy, and I don't look like him. Their argument caught the attention of Melanie, who appeared in the doorway, a concerned look on her face. What's going on in here, girls? She asked. Leona, still upset, held up the newspaper. Zoe says I look like this missing boy, she explained, her voice trembling slightly. She says I look like a boy, but I don't. Melanie stepped forward, gently taking the newspaper from Leona's hands. As she looked at the front page, Leona noticed a strange expression cross her face. It was similar to the look her own mother had when she saw the ad at the bus stop. A mixture of shock and something else Leona couldn't quite identify. For a long moment, Melanie stood there studying the picture intently. The silence in the room grew heavy, broken only by Zoe's nervous shuffling of puzzle pieces. Just as Leona was about to speak up, to ask Melanie why she was looking at the picture for so long, they were all startled by a sharp knock at the front door. Melanie seemed to snap out of her trance. She set the newspaper aside quickly and moved towards the door. I'll get it, she said, her voice sounding slightly strained. Leona and Zoe exchanged confused glances as Melanie disappeared into the hallway. They could hear the sound of the front door opening, followed by muffled voices. Then, to Leona's surprise, she heard her mother's voice. We're so sorry for the short notice, Melanie, Rebecca was saying, her words carrying clearly into the living room. Something's come up and we need to leave right away. Leona stood up, puzzle forgotten, and moved towards the hallway. She could see her parents standing in the doorway, looking flustered and slightly out of breath. Melanie's voice was filled with surprise. Rebecca! Calvin! What's going on? I thought Leona was staying for a few hours. Rebecca nodded, her movements jerky and nervous. Yes, that was the plan, but, well, we've had a change of plans. We're going on that holiday we mentioned, and we need to leave tonight. Leona stepped into the hallway, confusion and a touch of excitement warring inside her. We're going on holiday now, she asked, looking between her parents and Melanie. Her parents turned to her, and Leona was struck by the intensity in their eyes. There was something almost desperate in their expressions that sent a shiver of unease down her spine. "Yes, sweetheart," Calvin said, his voice forcefully cheerful. "It's a surprise trip." Melanie looked bewildered, her gaze moving from Leona to her parents and back again. "Wow," she said slowly. "This is very sudden. Where are you going? And with so much luggage?" She gestured to the car behind them, which Leona now noticed was packed full of suitcases and boxes. Rebecca stepped forward, placing a hand on Melanie's arm. "It's a long story," she said quietly. "We'll explain everything later. Right now, we really need to get going." Leona, caught up in the whirlwind of activity, barely had time to say goodbye to Zoe before she found herself being ushered back to the car. As she climbed into the back seat, she caught a glimpse of Melanie's face. The woman was watching them with a mixture of confusion and concern that made Leona's stomach twist with anxiety. As they pulled away from the curb, Leona turned in her seat to wave at Zoe and Melanie. The image of them standing in the doorway, looking worried and confused, stayed with her as they drove away into the gathering dusk. In the front seat, her parents were talking in low, urgent tones. Leona strained to hear what they were saying, but their words were too quiet to make out. All she knew was that something had changed, something big was happening, and she was being swept along in its wake. As the familiar streets of their neighborhood gave way to the main road, Leona couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a surprise holiday. There was an undercurrent of urgency, of fear even, that she didn't understand but could clearly sense. The car sped through the darkening streets, streetlights flickering to life as dusk settled over the city. Leona sat in the back seat, her small frame dwarfed by the luggage piled around her. Unable to contain her curiosity and growing anxiety any longer, Leona leaned forward, her voice small but determined. "Mom, Dad, where are we really going?" Her parents exchanged a quick glance before Rebecca turned in her seat to face Leona. Her smile seemed forced, not quite reaching her eyes. "We're going to stay at a hotel near the airport tonight, sweetie. Then tomorrow we'll be flying to our holiday destination." Leona's brow furrowed. "But where? Why won't you tell me?" Calvin spoke up, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It's a surprise, Pumpkin. We want it to be special for you." Leona wasn't satisfied with this answer. Her gaze swept over the mountain of luggage crammed into the car. "Why do we have so much stuff? How long are we staying?" Rebecca's smile faltered for a moment. "Well, we want to be prepared for anything. You never know what you might need on a big trip like this." As Leona processed this, her eyes fell on something familiar, wedged between two suitcases, her school bag. Next to it, she could see some of her textbooks and study materials she used at home. "Mom," she said slowly, confusion evident in her voice, "why did you pack my school stuff?" "We don't need that for a holiday, do we?" The car swerved slightly as Calvin's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Rebecca's face hardened, her forced cheerfulness giving way to irritation. "Leona," she snapped, her voice sharp. "That's enough questions. We've told you it's a surprise. You need to be quiet now." Leona recoiled at her mother's tone, shrinking back into her seat. She could feel tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, a mixture of hurt and fear welling up inside her. This didn't feel like the start of an exciting holiday. Something was wrong, but she didn't know what. The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. Leona stared out the window, watching unfamiliar neighborhoods flash by, each turn taking them further from the comfort and safety of home. Finally, they pulled into the parking lot of a large hotel near the airport. The building loomed over them, its windows glowing warmly against the night sky. Under different circumstances, Leona might have been excited about staying in such a grand place. Now it just felt intimidating. They checked in quickly, Calvin speaking in low, hurried tones with the receptionist, while Rebecca kept a firm grip on Leona's hand. As they made their way to their room, laden with luggage, Leona couldn't shake the feeling that her parents were constantly looking over their shoulders, as if expecting someone to be following them. Once in the room, Calvin began methodically unpacking certain items, while Rebecca drew the curtains tightly shut. Leona sat on one of the beds, watching her parents' frantic activity with growing unease. "Why don't we go down to the lobby for a drink?" Calvin suggested suddenly, his voice overly bright. "We could all use a little refreshment after that drive. How about an iced tea for you, Leona?" Rebecca nodded a bit too enthusiastically. "That's a wonderful idea. What do you say, sweetie?" Leona agreed hesitantly, hoping that maybe in a public space her parents might relax and things could start feeling normal again. They made their way down to the lobby, finding seats in the hotel bar. As they settled in with their drinks, a soda for Calvin, a glass of wine for Rebecca, and an iced tea for Leona, the young girl couldn't help but notice how her parents' eyes kept darting around the room, as if searching for potential threats. Leona sipped her iced tea slowly, the sweet liquid doing little to soothe her churning stomach. She was about to ask another question when she noticed a man at a nearby table staring intently in their direction. The man's gaze was fixed on Rebecca, his expression growing darker by the second. Suddenly he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He approached their table, his steps purposeful and angry. "You are disgusting," he spat, addressing Rebecca directly. "People like you should not be allowed to have a child." Rebecca froze, her face draining of color. "Excuse me," she managed to stammer out. The man's voice rose, drawing the attention of other patrons. "You are not a mother," he continued, his words laced with venom. "This is disgusting. People like you having children should be a crime." Leona shrank back in her chair, fear and confusion overwhelming her. She didn't understand what was happening, why this stranger was so angry at her mother. Before the situation could escalate further, a hotel staff member intervened, quickly moving to escort the agitated man away. The lobby buzzed with whispers and curious stares, all directed at their table. Rebecca stood up abruptly, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. "This has been too much," she said, her voice trembling. "We should go back to our room." As they hurried back to the elevator, Leona's mind was reeling. What did that man mean? Why was he so upset with her mother? The fear and confusion she had been feeling all evening crystallized into a hard knot in her stomach. Once back in their room, Leona couldn't contain herself any longer. "Mom," she asked, her voice small and scared, "what did that man mean? Why was he so angry at you?" Rebecca's face was pale, her movements jerky as she busied herself with unpacking. "He was just drunk, sweetie," she said, not meeting Leona's eyes. "Some people say silly things when they've had too much to drink." But Leona could tell this wasn't the whole truth. The man hadn't seemed drunk, just angry. And the way her mother was acting, the trembling hands, the averted gaze, told her there was more to this story than she was being told. The tension in the hotel room was palpable as Leona sat on the edge of the bed, her small frame dwarfed by the plush comforter. Her parents moved about the room, their actions frantic and disjointed, a stark contrast to their usual composed demeanor. "Leona," her mother's voice cut through the silence, "it's time for you to go to sleep. We have to get up early tomorrow to catch our flight." Leona wanted to protest, to demand answers to the myriad questions swirling in her mind, but the stern look on her mother's face made her think twice. She nodded silently and climbed under the covers, still fully dressed. Rebecca approached the bed, leaning down to place a kiss on Leona's forehead. The gesture, usually comforting, now felt strangely hollow. "Your father and I are going to go down to the hotel lobby for another drink," she said, her voice strained. "We'll be back soon, but you should try to sleep, okay?" Leona nodded again, watching as her parents exited the room, the door clicking shut behind them. The silence that followed was deafening. Despite her mother's instructions, sleep was the furthest thing from Leona's mind. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. The events of the day played on repeat in her head. The hushed conversations, the hurried packing, the angry man in the lobby. None of it made sense, and the more she thought about it, the more confused and scared she became. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when a shrill ringing cut through the silence. Leona sat up, startled, and realized the sound was coming from a phone on the bedside table. Her mother must have forgotten it in their rush to leave. Leona hesitated, unsure of what to do. She had been taught not to answer other people's phones, but what if it was important? What if it was about their surprise trip? The phone continued to ring insistently. Finally, Leona reached out and picked it up. The caller ID showed a name she recognized. Melanie, Zoe's mother. For a moment, Leona didn't say anything, her throat tight with uncertainty. But before she could decide whether to speak, Melanie's voice came through the line, urgent and worried. "Rebecca, tell me the truth. What is going on here? I've tried to contact you dozens of times. Now tell me the truth. Is this boy Leona?" Leona's heart raced at the strange question. She swallowed hard and finally found her voice. "Sorry, I'm not Mom, it's Leona. Mom is in the hotel lobby." Melanie's gasp was audible through the phone. "Leona, oh, I am so glad you're okay." Her voice softened, becoming gentle but urgent. "Leona, please tell me, did your parents tell you where you were going?" Confused by the question and the tone of Melanie's voice, Leona replied hesitantly, "No, it's a surprise, but I think we're going somewhere special. We have so much luggage and we even brought my school stuff. I think we're going on a long holiday trip." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh no, I knew it," Melanie muttered, more to herself than to Leona. Then her voice became more focused, more intense. "Leona, listen to me. You have to tell me where you are right now." "Why?" Leona asked, her confusion growing by the second. Melanie's voice was urgent, almost pleading. "Leona, you just have to trust me right now. Do you remember that newspaper you showed me earlier? There is something very wrong with this, and it has to do with you. Please, you just have to trust me now." Leona's mind was reeling. She didn't understand what was happening, but something in Melanie's voice, the urgency, the concern, made her want to comply. "We're at a hotel near the airport," she said slowly. "I think I saw the name. Skyway Stays or Skyray Stays. I'm not sure." "Okay, good," Melanie said, her voice tight with what sounded like relief. "Leona, I want you to stay on the line with me. I'm going to call for help. Whatever you do, don't tell your parents about this call, okay?" Before Leona could respond, she heard the sound of the hotel room door opening. Her parents' voices drifted in from the entryway, and panic seized her. "Mom and Dad are back," she whispered hurriedly into the phone. Her mother's voice rang out, confusion evident in her tone. "Leona? Why are the lights on? What are you doing on my phone?" Leona looked up, her eyes wide with fear, to see her mother rushing towards her. Rebecca's face paled as she saw the phone in Leona's hand, realization dawning in her eyes. In one swift motion, Rebecca snatched the phone from Leona's grasp. She glanced at the screen, her expression morphing from shock to anger. Without a word, she ended the call, then threw the phone to the ground with such force that it shattered into pieces. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of Rebecca's heavy breathing and the crunch of the phone beneath her foot as she ground it into the carpet. Leona sat frozen on the bed, tears welling up in her eyes. She had never seen her mother like this, so angry, so frightened. "Mum," she whimpered, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" But Rebecca wasn't listening. She turned to Calvin, who stood in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and fear. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Now. We don't have time to pack everything. Just grab what we need." Calvin nodded, springing into action. He began throwing essential items into a single suitcase, while Rebecca paced the room, muttering under her breath. Leona sat on the bed, watching in stunned silence as her parents moved around the room with frantic energy. She wanted to ask what was happening, why they were leaving so suddenly, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, Calvin zipped up the suitcase and turned to Leona. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his voice strained with false cheer. "We're going on an adventure." As they rushed out of the hotel room, leaving behind most of their belongings, Leona couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an adventure at all. This felt more like running away. But from what? And why? The questions swirled in her mind as they made their way down to the lobby, her small hand clasped tightly in her father's larger one. Whatever was happening, whatever secrets her parents were keeping, Leona knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The hotel lobby was eerily quiet, as Leona and her parents rushed through it, their footsteps echoing off the polished marble floors. The night clerk looked up from his computer, a puzzled expression on his face as he watched the family hurry towards the exit. Outside, the cool night air hit Leona's face, making her shiver. Her father, still gripping her hand tightly, raised his other arm to hail a taxi. As they waited, Leona could feel the tension radiating from her parents. They stood rigid, their eyes darting back and forth, scanning the street as if expecting danger to leap out at them from the shadows. A yellow taxi pulled up to the curb, and Calvin quickly ushered Leona into the back seat, following close behind. Rebecca slid in after them, slamming the door shut with more force than necessary. "Airport, please," Calvin said to the driver, his voice strained, "and hurry." As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Leona pressed her face against the window, watching the hotel recede into the distance. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She wanted to ask questions, to demand explanations, but the tense atmosphere in the car held her silent. They had only been driving for a few minutes when the first police siren pierced the night air. Leona felt her mother stiffen beside her, and she saw her father's knuckles turn white as he gripped the seat in front of him. "Can't you go any faster?" Rebecca hissed at the driver, her voice tight with panic. The driver, sensing the urgency, pressed down on the accelerator. But it was too late. More sirens joined the first, growing louder by the second. In the rear-view mirror, Leona could see the flashing lights of multiple police cars gaining on them rapidly. Suddenly, the taxi screeched to a halt, blocked by 3 police cars that had pulled up in front of them, effectively cutting off their escape route. Leona's heart pounded in her chest as she watched more police cars pull up behind and beside them, boxing them in completely. "Get out of the car, now!" a voice boomed through a megaphone, startling Leona. Her parents exchanged a look of desperation. For a moment, Leona thought they might try to run. But then, with a defeated sigh, Calvin opened the car door. "It's over," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. As they stepped out of the taxi, Leona found herself blinded by the bright spotlights from the police cars. She could make out the silhouettes of several officers, their weapons drawn and pointed in their direction. "On your knees!" The command rang out, harsh and unyielding. "Hands where we can see them!" Leona watched in horror as her parents slowly sank to their knees on the cold pavement, their hands raised above their heads. She stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. "The child, too!" another voice called out. "Everyone on the ground!" Tears streaming down her face, Leona lowered herself to the ground, the rough asphalt scraping her knees through her jeans. She could hear her mother sobbing nearby and her father's ragged breathing. Officers swarmed around them, quickly handcuffing her parents. Leona watched, paralyzed with fear, as they were roughly pulled to their feet and led towards separate police cars. "Mom, Dad!" She finally found her voice, crying out as she watched her parents being taken away. An officer approached her, his face a mix of concern and determination. He knelt down beside her, his voice gentler than the others had been. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. We're here to help you." But Leona couldn't understand how this was helping. How could taking her parents away be a good thing? She tried to stand, to run to her parents, but gentle hands held her back. "Leona!" A familiar voice cut through the chaos. Leona turned to see Melanie, Zoe's mother, pushing her way through the crowd of officers. Her face was a mask of worry and relief. "Oh, thank God," Melanie breathed as she reached Leona, pulling the girl into a tight embrace. "I was so worried. But you're safe now, sweetheart. You're safe." Leona clung to Melanie, her small body shaking with sobs. Over Melanie's shoulder, she could see her parents being placed into separate police cars. Her mother's face was streaked with tears, while her father stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "What's happening?" Leona managed to choke out between sobs. "Why are they taking my parents away?" Melanie pulled back slightly, her hands on Leona's shoulders. She opened her mouth as if to explain, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. An officer approached them, his expression grave. "We need to take her to the station," he said to Melanie. "There's a lot we need to sort out." Melanie nodded, then turned back to Leona. "We're going to go with the nice officer now, okay? I'll be with you the whole time. I promise." As Melanie guided her towards one of the police cars, Leona couldn't help but look back at the receding figures of her parents. The flashing lights of the police cars cast an eerie glow over the scene, making it feel like some terrible nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And as the police car door closed behind her, Leona knew that her life had just changed forever. The questions that had been building all day now loomed larger than ever, demanding answers that she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The police station was a flurry of activity as Leona was led inside, her small hand clasped tightly in Melanie's. The harsh fluorescent lights made everything seem stark and unfamiliar, a far cry from the warm, comforting world she had known just hours ago. Officers bustled about, their voices a low murmur of urgency and purpose. Leona felt overwhelmed, her mind struggling to process the rapid series of events that had led her here. She looked up at Melanie, seeking some kind of explanation, some reassurance that this was all a misunderstanding and that everything would soon return to normal. "Melanie?" Leona's voice quivered, barely above a whisper. "What's going on here? Why did they take my parents away?" Melanie's face was a mask of concern and sympathy. She knelt down to Leona's level, her hands gently gripping the girl's shoulders. "Oh, Leona," she began, her voice soft and hesitant. "I don't know how to explain this to you. It's complicated." Leona felt frustration building inside her, mixing with her fear and confusion. "Please," she pleaded, "I need to know. What did my parents do wrong?" Melanie took a deep breath, her eyes searching Leona's face. "Do you remember the newspaper you showed me earlier? The one with the missing boy on the front page?" Leona nodded slowly, unsure of where this was going. "Well," Melanie continued, her voice careful and measured, "that boy. Leona, that boy is you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and incomprehensible. Leona shook her head, unable to process what she had just heard. "What do you mean that's me? I'm not a boy, I'm a girl, I'm Leona." Before Melanie could respond, an officer approached them. His face was kind but serious as he addressed them. "We need to take her statement now," he said to Melanie, "and we have some questions we need to ask. Would you like to come with us?" Melanie nodded, standing up and taking Leona's hand once more. "Of course, I'm not leaving her side." They were led to a small room with a table and chairs. Unlike the harsh interrogation rooms often seen in movies, this one was decorated with cheerful posters and had a small collection of toys in one corner. It was clearly designed to be as non-threatening as possible for children. A woman in a smart suit was waiting for them inside. She introduced herself as Janine Carter, a social worker assigned to Leona's case. Another man, dressed in plain clothes but with a badge clipped to his belt, introduced himself as Detective Mark Thompson. "Hello, Leona," Detective Thompson said, his voice gentle. "We know this must be very confusing and scary for you right now, but we're here to help you, okay? We just need to ask you a few questions and explain some things." Leona nodded mutely, her eyes wide and wary. The detective pulled out a familiar newspaper and placed it on the table in front of Leona. The missing boy's face stared up at her, and she felt a strange twist in her stomach as she looked at it. "Leona," Detective Thompson began, his voice careful and measured, "this boy in the picture, his name is Tom Rockwell. He went missing from an orphanage when he was 2 years old." Leona nodded slowly, still not understanding where this was going. "The thing is, Leona," the detective continued, "we have reason to believe that you are Tom Rockwell." He paused, glancing at Melanie, who nodded encouragingly. The detective turned back to Leona, his voice gentle as he explained further. "You see, when you were at Zoe's house earlier today, you showed Melanie that newspaper with the missing boy's picture. After you left, Melanie took another look at it and discussed it with her husband. They both agreed that the boy in the photo bore a striking resemblance to you. It raised some concerns for them." Melanie leaned in, her voice soft but clear. "I tried to reach your mother to ask her about it, but she ignored me. Then, when you answered the phone at the hotel and told me about all the luggage, sweetie, I realized your parents must have become frightened because of the missing person ads. It seemed they were trying to flee with you." The words hit Leona like a physical blow. She shook her head vehemently, tears springing to her eyes. "No," she said, her voice rising. "No, that's not true. I'm not a boy. I'm a girl. I'm Leona Sanders." The social worker Janine leaned forward, her voice soft and reassuring. "Leona, sweetie, we understand this is very difficult to hear, and it's important for you to know that how you feel inside, whether you feel like a girl or a boy, that's entirely up to you. We're not here to tell you who you should be. We're just trying to understand what happened to you." Leona's mind was reeling. She looked from face to face, searching for some sign that this was all a mistake, a misunderstanding. But all she saw was sympathy and concern. "But my parents," she said, her voice small and uncertain, "they've always been my parents. How could I be someone else?" Detective Thompson's face grew serious. "Leona, we believe that the people you've known as your parents, they're not your biological parents. We think they may have taken you from the orphanage when you were very young." The room seemed to spin around Leona. She felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath her feet, leaving her floating in a sea of confusion and disbelief. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that can't be true. They love me. They couldn't." Melanie reached out, placing a comforting hand on Leona's arm. "I know this is hard to believe, sweetheart. But there are things that your parents did that weren't right, things that have made us very concerned about your safety and well-being." Leona looked up at Melanie, tears streaming down her face. "What things? What did they do?" The adults in the room exchanged glances, seeming to have a silent conversation about how much to reveal. The small room in the police station felt like it was closing in on Leona. The walls, despite their cheerful posters, seemed to loom over her, and the air felt thick and heavy. She sat in her chair, her small frame hunched over, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Detective Thompson cleared his throat softly, drawing Leona's attention back to the present. "Leona," he began, his voice gentle, "I know this is all very overwhelming, but we need to ask you a few more questions. Is that okay?" Leona nodded mutely, her eyes wide and wary. "Can you tell us about your life with the Sanders?" the detective asked. "Did they ever do anything that made you uncomfortable or scared?" Leona's brow furrowed as she thought back over her life. Despite the shock of recent revelations, she couldn't recall any moments of fear or discomfort with her parents. "No," she said quietly. "They were always kind to me. They loved me." The adults exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of concern and skepticism. "They never hurt you?" Janine, the social worker, pressed gently. "Never made you do anything you didn't want to do?" Leona shook her head emphatically. "No, never. Only today. Today they were different, angry and scared. But before that, they were always good to me." Detective Thompson leaned forward, his face serious. "Leona, this is very important. We need to know if your parents ever told you that you were a boy, or if they ever talked about you being different from other girls." Leona's mind raced, trying to recall any such conversations, but all she could remember was a life where she had always been Leona, always been a girl. "No," she said, her voice small but certain. "They never said anything like that. I've always been a girl. I am a girl." Leona opened her mouth to say more, but before she could speak, the door to the room burst open. Another officer rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. In his hand, he held a small orange pill bottle. "We found this in the mother's purse," he announced, placing the bottle on the table. Melanie leaned forward, her eyes widening in recognition. "Those are the pills I've seen her mother Rebecca taking," she said. "She told me they were her hormone pills, part of her transition." Leona felt a surge of frustration. "No," she insisted, her voice rising. "Those are my asthma pills. I have to take them every day or I might have trouble breathing. Mom always makes sure I take them on time." The new officer picked up the bottle, examining the label closely. "These aren't asthma medication," he said, his voice grave. These are high-dose estrogen pills. They're used for hormone therapy in transgender adults. A child should definitely not be taking these." The room fell silent as the implications of this discovery sank in. Leona felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She looked from face to face, searching for some sign that this was all a mistake, but all she saw was growing concern and alarm. Melanie broke the tense silence, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh my... I knew about Leona's mother," she began, struggling to find the right words. "It was never really a secret in our community that Rebecca is transgender. I knew she took hormone pills for her transition, but..." She paused, shaking her head in disbelief. "I never, not in my wildest dreams, would have thought she was giving those pills to Leona, too. It's unthinkable." Detective Thompson leaned forward, his expression grave. "I think we need to get Leona to a hospital right away," he said, his voice urgent. "We don't know what effects these pills might have had on her body. She needs to be examined by a doctor as soon as possible." Janine nodded in agreement. "I'll make the arrangements," she said, standing up and moving towards the door. Leona felt panic rising in her chest. "No," she protested, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go to the hospital. I want to go home. I want my parents." Melanie moved to Leona's side, wrapping an arm around the girl's shoulders. "I know this is scary, sweetheart," she said softly, "but we need to make sure you're okay. The doctors just want to help you." As the adults bustled around her, making phone calls and arrangements, Leona felt as if she was watching everything from a great distance. The world she had known, the life she had lived, was crumbling around her. And as they prepared to take her to the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that with each passing moment, she was moving further and further away from everything she had ever known and loved. The police car cut through the night, its siren silent but its lights casting intermittent blue flashes across the darkened streets. As they made their way towards the hospital across town, Leona sat in the back seat, sandwiched between Melanie and the social worker Janine. Detective Thompson sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at Leona with a mixture of concern and sympathy. The city passed by in a blur outside the windows, but Leona barely noticed. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The events of the past few hours played on repeat in her head, each recollection bringing a fresh wave of pain and uncertainty. "Melanie," Leona's voice was small, barely audible over the hum of the car's engine. "What's going to happen to my parents?" Melanie exchanged a glance with Janine before answering, her voice gentle but firm. "Leona, what your parents did, it was very wrong. They broke the law, and they'll have to face the consequences for that. They'll probably have to go to prison." Leona felt tears welling up in her eyes again. Despite everything she had learned, despite the betrayal and the lies, she couldn't shake the love she felt for the people who had raised her. "But they're not bad people," she protested weakly. "They love me. They've always taken care of me." Melanie pulled Leona closer, her arm a comforting weight around the girl's shoulders. "I know this is hard to understand, sweetheart. Love is complicated, and sometimes people who love us can still do things that are wrong. Your parents, they made some very bad choices, even if they thought they were doing it out of love." Leona nodded slowly, trying to process this. A new fear suddenly gripped her, and she looked up at Melanie with wide, frightened eyes. "What's going to happen to me now? Where will I go if they go to prison?" The question hung heavy in the air of the police car. Melanie felt tears forming in her own eyes as she saw the fear and vulnerability in Leona's face. She hugged the girl tighter, her voice thick with emotion as she spoke. "Leona, I want you to listen to me very carefully," she said. "You are not alone. You have your best friend Zoe, you have me, and there are many other people who care about you and want to help you. I know this must be incredibly hard for you, but you have to know that you are a very strong and brave person for enduring all this." Leona buried her face in Melanie's side, her small body shaking with sobs. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I don't know who I am anymore." Melanie stroked Leona's hair gently. "You're you," she said softly. "No matter what name you have or what your past is, you're still the same person inside, and we're going to help you figure this all out, I promise." The car fell silent after that, save for Leona's quiet sniffles. As they drove through the night towards the hospital, Melanie found herself making a silent promise. She would be there for Leona through this difficult time, no matter how hard it got. She hoped that one day Leona would be able to fully understand the truth behind what had happened to her, and that she would have the strength and support to decide for herself whether she wanted to live as Tom Rockwell or continue as Leona. As the hospital came into view, its windows glowing like beacons in the night, Melanie felt a mix of hope and apprehension. This was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey for Leona. There would be medical examinations, psychological evaluations, legal proceedings, and countless other challenges ahead. But looking down at the girl curled up against her side, Melanie felt a fierce determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Leona wouldn't have to navigate this new, confusing world alone.